of Rack Madness here with the Oklahoma Department of Wildlife. We're coming to you live today from our headquarters here in Oklahoma City. We're going to be discussing a little bit about how to pattern deer, and if time permits, as we get in, we'll also discuss a little bit about deer populations and maybe some of the effects that this weather has had. You're welcome to join in the conversation today. We'll be taking some online questions. As well, if you're unable to join us today, but you're watching this later, let me also remind you that you could always submit questions to our social media platforms or through our main homepage, which is www.wildlifedepartment.com. So follow the links there, and we'll do our absolute best to get you the answers to any questions that you have. So if you miss out on the live event, don't despair. We're still going to try to get you the information you're looking for. Allow me to introduce myself. My name is Jerry Shaw. I'm the program supervisor for the Wildlife Division here at the Oklahoma Department of Wildlife Conservation. I'm beginning my 27th year with the agency, and all 27 of those have been with the big game program. So here in Oklahoma, that means white-tailed deer, mule deer, antelope, and elk. So today we're going to be discussing a little bit how, as a hunter, you can put some information to your best use and maybe have a little bit better chance of connecting with a good mature whitetail next season. So we're going to be talking a little bit about patterning. So what is patterning? Patterning is basically taking a little bit of understanding and a little bit of knowledge about the biology and physiology of a whitetail deer, and then coupling that with knowledge of the area that you intend to hunt and using those two in combination to help you better your odds of getting in a location where you can meet up with that big buck you've been chasing. So to begin with, we're going to talk about 5 tips that you can start with, and then we're going to go into a little bit more, and we're going to finish out with 5 additional ones that are a little bit more advanced. So the first thing that you want to do, the first tip, the first step in patterning any animal, in this case we are talking about mature bucks, is you've got to educate yourself. You need to educate yourself on what that animal needs biologically, and you need to educate yourself on what that animal's needs are at different times of the year. So the first thing you want to do is read. Crack open magazines, look at some reference materials, do online searches. The information's out there. Talk to other hunters, talk to more experienced hunters, talk to farmers, talk to folks that you know that have been successful, and see what it is that they're doing. What you're going to want to look for is the things that a deer needs to survive. Basically, those are food, water, and shelter. Once you have an understanding about those elements, then you need to go beyond what they just need, but what they prefer. Just like I need to eat every once in a while, that's obvious, but I prefer to eat at certain places. So if you're wanting to catch me for breakfast, you need to go where I prefer to go rather than just anywhere that I need to go. Deer are like us. We have different activities based on different times of the year. For example, in the summertime, you might find people hanging out at the lake or the swimming pool. Same with deer. They've got different preferences for different times of the year. So learn in your studies, learn where the deer are going to be and what they're going to be doing at that specific time of the year. And the last thing that you might want to look at is not only learn what brings the deer, or not only learn where the deer are going, but it's also important to learn where the deer avoid. And we'll talk a little bit more about that here in a few minutes. Other aspect that you need to educate yourself on is plants. These deer are living out there every day. They have to make their entire existence off what's around them. So you need to know the plants almost as well as the deer do. You need to know how to identify them. And there are several good sources online that you can look up plants. You need to know if they're important to deer, and if they are important, why are they important, and at what time of the year are they important? Like we said earlier, not every plant is going to be important at every day out of the year, and they might not even provide the same amount of forage at different times of the year. For example, I have persimmon trees on a piece of property that I hunt. It's not going to do me any good to hunt those persimmon trees early in archery season because those persimmons are not ripe yet. The deer will actually leave those alone until they become ripe, which happens very late in the year, often the second half of archery season. So it doesn't do you any good just to be able to identify the plants, but you also need to tie that into the time of year that they're going to be useful. Now, just because you know where the plants are and you know what they are, doesn't mean that that's all that you need to know. If you wanted to improve those plants for wildlife use, in this case deer, you need to understand what time of year you can fertilize them. For example, fertilizing an oak tree so it will produce more acorns. You need to know if that's something you can manipulate with fire. Will a controlled burn help increase those plants? If it's a non-desirable plant, will a controlled fire help control that plant? Other ways that you can manipulate the plants in your hunting area is by disking. And one that we often don't think about as plant manipulation is simply thinning out the area around your tree stand. Make it where you've got clear shooting lanes and make it where you can see a little bit better. Not only will that help you to see deer and make better shots, but just thinning out that overstory can actually improve the forage around the base of your tree. So the first thing you wanted to do, like we said, is educate yourself on the deer, what they need biologically at different times of the year. The second thing you need to do is educate yourself on where those deer can find those particular needs on the property you hunt. So you need to know what they want and you need to know where they can get it. Basically, it's that simple. If you can do those things, then you can pattern a deer. Well, it's really not that simple, and anybody that's deer hunted for any length of time understands that. There's almost an infinite number of variables that can occur. And so we have got to spend some time narrowing them down and understanding the ins and outs of the periodicity or what's important at certain times of the year. And how do we do that? We do that by getting to our third tip, and that's put in the legwork. You know, you could read all the books, you could study all the articles, you could read magazines and online forums. That tells you the biology, that tells you the theory, but you can't put that theory into practice unless you actually get out on the landscape and walk around. So right now, which is late winter here in Oklahoma, it's a fantastic time to scout. The leaves are off the trees. You can see a lot better because there are no leaves. Deer season's over. You're not going to be disturbing the deer by walking around in their habitat. And it's a great time to look for sheds, a great time to find rub lines or even scrapes. Things that you want to look for when you're out walking around this time of year are the deer's basic needs. Again, we talked about that earlier: food, water, and shelter. You need to figure out where those items are on the individual property that you plan to hunt, and you need to figure out the best route that a deer can take to get from one to the other. But remember, those food items are going to be different from the late winter when you're out there scouting and earlier in the season when you might be out there hunting. So on your walks, on your travels through your hunting area and putting in the legwork, is you want to look for multiple ambush points. You want to look where you can set your stand or your blind, and don't just pick one location. You need to pick several locations based on the wind and the prevailing wind on a day you plan to hunt, as well as sun position. You never want to put the sun at your back if you're up in a tree because that silhouettes you. But try to get around and find those ambush points. So number 4, while you're walking around, is try to identify bedding cover and refuge areas. So a mature buck doesn't get mature by spending their time in the fall out in the wide open where they can easily be seen and easily be harvested. Areas you want to look for are refuge areas where the buck feels safe, can get away from pressure, but yet still be in tune with what's going on around him. Just because it's thick cover doesn't mean that it's necessarily good for deer. A buck especially likes to be able to see what's coming, and more importantly, he needs to be able to smell what's coming. One of the best tips I can give you for patterning a big mature buck is to look for islands of habitat. And by an island of habitat, I'm talking about a small little pocket that's out of the way that other hunters might not even pay attention to because they don't feel it's going to be big enough to hold any deer, much less a good mature deer. Say an area between 2 fields where there's just a little strip of cover. It might not even be 10 yards wide, but that area can absolutely hold a whitetail buck that just slips in there and beds down and watches the world go by. Now, these little islands, it's important to note you don't necessarily want to place a stand in one of these islands and upset his little refuge. But what you want to do is plan his entrance and his escape routes from that area. And that's where you want to set your stand. Allow the deer to have their bedding areas, allow them to have the refuge areas without you actually getting in there and disturbing it, but just plan on a way that you could hunt coming in or going out of that area. Now, the fifth one, and as an older deer hunter, this is an area where I kind of struggle, but the generations coming up behind me have really embraced, and that's the use of technology. Technology is an incredible tool that we didn't have when I began. Google Earth in particular is one way that you can scout your property. It provides you current, up-to-date satellite photos with a clarity that is just unheard of. You can zoom in on your hunting property and actually pick out those refuge areas, those little isolated islands that we were talking about just a second ago. And you can figure out how you want to get in and how you want to get out undetected. You can locate food sources. You can locate water sources. You can locate possible travel routes from one to the other and figure out where you want to set your stand up, all without ever putting your foot on the ground. Now, that doesn't mean that that's going to suffice for every situation. You're still going to need to get out and what we call ground truth it or verify what you saw on the satellite. But use technology, especially on these days when you're sitting around the house in the evenings before you go to bed. It's a great idea to just open up Google Earth and do a little bit of internet scouting. Second one under the use of technology is a little bit more involved and frankly a little bit more fun for me, and that's the use of a drone. Small drones are getting more and more affordable every day. You can find drones in Walmart that have got technology that's just unbelievable at what they can do. So I have actually used a drone to fly over a property where I hunt. It gives me an idea about what it looks like at different times of the year without me actually having to go in there and disturb the area. I can fly over and I can see if an area is thinned out. If I can look and see if I've got too much tree cover where I'm not getting enough sunlight to the soil to grow good plants. While it's not anything you want to use during the hunting season, you don't want to be scouting actually deer. You just want to scout locations to hunt preseason and postseason. But drones are an excellent way that you can get out and actually extend your season looking for deer a little bit. It's pretty handy. So the last item I have under technology, and this is a huge one. In my opinion, if you ask me what is one thing that has changed deer hunting the most in my 27-year career, I'm going to tell you it's trail cameras. Trail cameras give you the opportunity to be present on your property 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, whether it's raining, whether it's snowing, whether the sun is shining. That trail camera is going to be out there and it's going to be recording anything that walks in front of it. So it's hands down the best scouting device on the market. And I always recommend, if you can afford it and you've got good cell service in an area, a cell camera enabled trail camera, or I'm sorry, a cell phone enabled trail camera is the best bet. Again, it just keeps that human presence or the human scent out of an area more than if you're going in every 2 weeks and checking batteries. It'll give you a good inventory for what's on the property, although you have to remember things change based on the time of the year. But this time of the year, a lot of hunters are actually pulling their trail cameras out of the woods. For me, this is the time of year when I want those trail cameras in there and working for me. I want them to be able to tell me what made it through the season. I want it to tell me, did the young buck I passed on this year, did my neighbors also pass on him? Is he still out there? Is he still growing? So for me, this time of the year is especially important for patterning those deer and knowing what is actually remaining on your property. So some of the last hints that we have, the last 5 are hunt productive times. Deer, both male and female, are most active early in the morning for the first 2 hours, the hour before sunlight and the hour after, as well as the 2 hours prior to sunset, and then the hour after. Again, that changes from time to time, from season to season, but year in and year out, deer after deer after deer will show that same pattern. Now, I'm not saying don't be in your stand during the middle of the day, but I'm just saying during those productive times, make the best use of your hunting time by being in the woods when the deer are going to be the most active. Now, in addition to just the time of day, there's also seasonality. And for a deer hunter, there are three main seasons that we need to be concerned about. And you want to make every effort to be in the woods. But each one of them has a little bit different hunting technique. For example, the pre-rut. And for the new deer hunters, the rut is just the breeding season for white-tailed deer. Now, for the pre-rut, you want to find a location that's got plenty of rubs, which is where the deer are rubbing the velvet off of their antlers, and they're using a small bush or sapling to do this. And you can see where they've actually stripped the bark off as they rub that velvet off of their antlers. If you can find a series of those rubs in a row or in a line, that's pretty indicative of a travel corridor for that whitetail buck. So if you see that rub line, that's a pretty good location to try to find a stand where you can either set a tree stand or set a blind up. After the pre-rut, we advance a little bit more in the season and we actually enter the rut. That is when the deer are actively, the bucks are actively chasing a doe. What do you want to look for? How are you going to pattern a buck during the rut? That one's pretty simple. The males are going to be where the females are. So you want to look for a good food source where these bucks, or where the does are finding plenty of food, where they're spending a long time of day around, and just hunt near that food source. As those does come into season, that buck is going to be chasing, and that's a pretty good way to find the buck of your dreams, is hunt the food sources during the rut. And the last season we're going to talk about is the post-rut. Now, during the rut, a whitetail buck will forego food. He will be so busy chasing females that he won't bother to eat himself. He won't bother to stop and pick up food. He's going to be looking for a girlfriend. So as that rut ends, these bucks are very run down nutritionally, and they're trying to pack in as much food as they can before the harshness of winter hits. As we know here in Oklahoma, we just went through a terribly harsh spell. Those bucks are needing that food. So I would concentrate my efforts on very fat-rich foods such as acorns. If you can find an area that still has acorns on the ground post-rut, then those deer, the bucks, are going to be in a pattern to eat those high-fat foods to help build up that fat reserve that they ran off chasing a does during the rut. So number seven on the list probably has more to do with those of us that hunt public land than private, but it's still a pretty good notion to have under your hat. And that is, instead of patterning the deer, pattern the people. Pattern the people that are hunting around you. Pattern the people that are hunting the same area that you hunt. To be honest, deer hunters are a lot more predictable than the deer. You can have a more effective pattern using those other hunters to your advantage than you can trying necessarily to pattern the bucks themselves. Just as we're talking about using the deer's habits to shape where you hunt, use the other hunters' habits to shape where you hunt. More importantly, maybe not where you hunt. Make sure that you're in the woods before they are. Get there very early in the dark, go deeper than they would normally go, and set up your stand and wait. As it gets closer to legal shooting time and more of those deer hunters come in, the activity around the parking area is going to push deer further and further and further out from that parking area. So if you're on the outside and they're pushing deer to you along those escape routes that you found during last fall's scouting, you've got a pretty good chance of getting a shot at a deer. Again, we talked about the isolated pockets of cover, those little islands. Most deer hunters won't take the time to look in those. Most of them are going to view that as a wasted walk to go look in there. They're going to look at that as being too small to actually hold a deer, much less a good quality deer. Well, the deer think the same things. They think that nobody's going to bother them in there. So that's where they're going to go. So use other people's habits to your advantage and seek out those little isolated pockets. Also, you can count on the hunters to get restless mid-morning. One pattern that holds true for most deer hunters, about 9 o'clock, 10 o'clock, we're starting to get pretty chilled. The coffee in the thermos is starting to get a little cool. Breakfast is starting to sound pretty good. We've eaten the snacks in our pack and we're ready to move. So we tend to get out of our stands. We tend to climb out of our blind and move around at that time. Use that to your advantage. Sit for an extra hour. Let those other hunters in the area again, move around and let their disturbance push deer along those escape routes that you identified earlier in the year, where you can ambush the deer. And the last one, especially on our wildlife management areas, is count on other hunters to hunt immediately adjacent to any food plot. Really the food plots that we put in are more for hunter management than it is for wildlife management. So don't spend your time, if you're serious about shooting a mature buck, don't spend a whole lot of time hunting around these food plots. Most of the time, those are going to be avoided during daylight hours when you could actually get a shot at a mature buck. They're a pretty good bet for hunting immature bucks, smaller bucks, and especially our does. They're not quite as adverse to being in those open areas. But if you're hunting a food plot for a mature buck, you better be there during the rut. Otherwise, it's going to be a pretty tough bet to connect with one of them. So my eighth tip for you in how to pattern deer is to watch deer at every opportunity. All year long, spend some time in the area that you intend to hunt. Climb in your tree stand in the middle of summer. Put on some bug spray and go take a walk in the woods in the springtime. Get out and do a little shed hunting in the winter, and then hunt morel mushrooms in the spring, and just be out there and take every chance you can to observe deer. Spring and summertime patterns, they're not necessarily going to hold up in the fall. Deer are going to be eating different foods at different times. Different food sources are going to mature differently and be available, and different needs are going to come around at different times of the year. But it will give you some insight on how those deer are traveling around within their environment. It will help you to identify trails that are used more often than others. It'll give you an idea about ambush points that you might be able to set up. And very importantly is watch their interactions. When you're out there, take a pair of binoculars and don't just watch deer, but watch an individual deer and see how it reacts. See what it does with its ears when another deer comes around. See if it's looking forward. See what it does with its head. See how it interacts. Watches it. Does it interact differently with a buck? Does it interact differently with a doe? These little social cues can be very helpful when you're in the tree in the fall and you see a doe and you hear a noise. Watch that doe. Her reaction will often tell you if it's a buck coming in behind her or if it's a doe. So watch these deer and learn and use that to your advantage year round. Don't just look at deer, but really study them and try to figure out what some of their social cues are. Number 9, and this is a big one for the older generation like myself. Carry a notebook, make notes. For me, at my age, I had a trampoline growing up, and I couldn't tell how many times I got hit in the head. And if I don't write it down, I'll forget about it. And I absolutely will forget about a deer trail, or I will forget about a rub line if I don't make notes. If I'm on one of my walks and I find a sand plum thicket, absolutely I'm going to mark that down. If I'm on a walk out scouting and I find some sheds, I need to write that down. Where I found them, what they looked like, how big were they? Were they by a fence? Were they in the middle of the field? Take notes. If you harvest deer, if you shoot deer off of a property, take notes on what you shot. Send in that information. Send in a deer jaw to the wildlife department where we can age it for you and keep that information to help you have some idea about what your deer herd looks like. But I would tell you to keep a note on food sources that are available, where you find sheds, where you sat in a stand, if that stand was productive. If that stand was productive in the morning, was it productive in the evening? Did you see bucks? Did you see does? All of that information at the time that you're observing it is pretty important. But 3 months down the road, if you're like me, life takes over and you forget those details. But it's fantastic to have a notebook that you can go back to while you're sitting at home, looking at Google Earth, looking at footage, and to be able to say, oh yeah, that's where I found that shed. So keep a notebook. And my last tip for patterning bucks is when the season's getting close, stay out of the woods. I run deer cameras on the property I hunt, and nothing excites me more than being able to go out there and look at them and see what I captured on that camera. But sometimes my excitement makes me want to go out a little bit too close to season. And research study after research study has shown that mature bucks are very sensitive to human presence. If you go into an area and that deer detects your presence, and it can detect your presence even 24, 48 hours later just through the scent you leave behind, there's been research that shows that deer can avoid that area for up to 10 days from that one experience. So my excitement in checking trail cameras, thinking I'm doing the right thing so that I know what's on my property, may actually harm me in my chase for a big buck. So, like we said earlier, this technology is fantastic. If you can get a cellular-enabled trail camera, boy, you can have those pictures delivered right to your phone. If you can't, I would suggest you get some long-running batteries and as big of a card as that camera will hold, and make your trips as infrequent as possible into that area. Make sure that you've got your stand in place and secure before hunting season starts. Don't go in and clear out shooting lanes 2 weeks before the season. All you're doing is disturbing that pattern that you have already spent all the effort and time to establish. You're altering that pattern by your activities. That's the last thing you want to do. If you do your homework, when it comes time for the test, you want to be prepared and not sleep late. So other things you want to do is plan your route into and out of your tree stand to minimize that amount of disturbance. You want to basically hunt your way into the tree. You want to be as silent as possible. Expect a deer to be watching you at any time. I mean, you've done your homework. You've picked out the best spot on your property where you think you're going to see deer. Treat it like it's the best place to see deer, and sneak into it and sneak out of it. Don't don't bang your tree stand. Don't get in there in the morning and shake the dew off your seat. Start hunting from the time you leave your pickup truck, and don't stop hunting until you get back to your pickup truck. Every step you take in that woods, have it in the back of your head that you're being watched by a deer, and you want to be as quiet and as stealthful as you can. Keep that disturbance to a minimum. So that is basically all we have today on how to pattern bucks. I don't know if we had any questions come in, but if we do, we'll
I've
be.
got one question here. Buck Slayer has asked any tips on the types of major late season food sources deer use. Buck Slayer says, I've seen them eating hedge apples, bean pods, and some sort of tree tips when we had snow cover in northeast Oklahoma. Then Buck Slayer assumes, well, maybe that's all because of acorns have probably rotten by that point, so they're not eating them. But then commented, Jerry probably needs Onyx.
Onyx is a fantastic product. If you have access to it, it is a great product. And I would expect from the questions that were asked by Deer Slayer, as well as the moniker Deer Slayer, he probably has a pretty good idea about what he's talking about there. Hedge apples or Osage orange is actually one of the preferred forages for white-tailed deer in Oklahoma. If you have hedge apples on your property, and that is one of the things that you want to look for in having that plant ID skill, is you want to hunt those. I mean, they're fantastic sources. But he's absolutely right. Late season forage is much different than early season. Early season, the deer are keyed in on oak trees. As those acorns lay on the ground, they tend to get wormy. Just a worm actually will invade the acorn, and the deer avoid those. So as those acorns get used up, the deer transfer to different food sources. Um, Late season mast, you've got other plants that are dropping. The bean pods for coffee tree and such are also pretty good forage at that time of year. If you're talking really late season, in the terms of December, if you're an archery hunter, one of the best patterns is agricultural fields at that time really start to pick up activity. Again, most of the mature bucks are going to avoid those areas during the daylight hours, but that's part of that patterning process. You want to find their bedding cover, and then you want to find the adjacent feeding cover, and you want to set up an ambush point in between them. But yeah, late season forage, a lot of Oklahoma where it's available, agricultural forage is fantastic. Winter wheat is a staple for white-tailed deer in a lot of Oklahoma. But again, that depends on the part of the state you hunt. I know you're saying up in Northeast, probably don't have a whole lot of wheat fields up there. You might find some soybeans, but they're not going to be available that time of year. So look for various food sources. And one of the best resources I can tell you as far as food Availability and Use in Oklahoma is a Noble Foundation publication, should be available on their website, that they did a study where they actually did stomach contents for deer throughout the year. Now, it is geared towards cross timbers or the middle section of the state, but it's easily transferable to the Northeast. Um, as you were saying about the browse, a lot of folks think that deer are grazers like cows. They see them and it looks like they're picking up grasses. They're actually not picking up grass. They're picking up the weeds or what we call forbs on the ground. And then as those become unavailable, they will use browse, which is it's the woody stems and leaves off trees. It's not as palatable, meaning they don't like it. Remember, way back in the beginning, we talked about foods that they eat because they need them, as opposed to foods that they eat because they prefer them. Browse is not necessarily a preferred forage. It is a forage of necessity. It's one that they will eat if they need to, but it's not necessarily their favorite. If there's other forage available, if there's soft mass available, if there's acorns available, browse will make up a smaller and smaller percentage of that diet. When things get tough, when the ground gets covered with snow or ice, as we've had, you'll see that browse use go up. Now, as far as patterning, that makes it very difficult because there's browse pretty much everywhere you go. So again, if you do your homework and you find those bedding areas and those refuge areas, that's going to be what your best bet is as far as coming up with a good buck. Any other questions?
How did the recent winter weather affect predictively deer populations?
So that will be kind of where we finish out the discussion today is the winter weather. As we're recording this live, I think it was in the 60s outside. For a week ago at this same time in the afternoon, it was below zero across the state. Oklahoma had a period where we had over 250 hours straight of below freezing temperatures. It was rough on a lot of wildlife. Fortunately, white-tailed deer are a megavertebrate. They're a large animal. They're strong. They're powerful. They can dig through that snow. And as we just discussed with Deer Slayer's question, that browse is going to be available above the snow line. So under normal circumstances such as this, where the snow lasts for a short time and there's still browse available to deer, we're not going to see a whole lot of long-lasting impact on our deer herd. There may have been some local individual deer that had some issue, that were weak, that were run down, that had some other disease. I have heard some reports about deer that had mange, that because of that mange, they had hair loss. And we have had a few deer succumb to freezing because of that. But in general, a healthy white-tailed deer is going to have the ability to dig through the snow. Now, it's a different story if we've got ice. A lot of times that ice will be so thick that the deer can't get to it. But with this last snow we had, because of the extreme temperatures and the powderiness of that snow, even if it was 1.5 feet, 2 foot deep, those deer still had the ability to get through it. But they really didn't need to. They could eat above the snow line on that browse. Now, in some areas where you can see a browse line, which is basically the deer have eaten all of that available plant material off, and there's no more above that where they could reach, then we might start having issues. But again, that's an issue where the habitat has been stripped because you simply have too many deer. And hopefully we don't have too many places in Oklahoma that's the case. Any other questions?
One last one, and he was Buckslayer asked again, but said, said I'm guessing he's asking if he should just hunt the nearest food source next to the bedding, or
so that's a hard one, and you want to be as close as possible because a mature buck, research has shown, has a smaller home range than an immature buck. A mature buck has a smaller home range than a doe. So they try to make those forays or those trips out of that refuge cover as short as possible. So absolutely, you want to hunt as close to that area as you can, or that refuge area as you can, without disturbing that refuge area. And that distance is going to vary by situation. It's going to vary by cover type. It's going to vary by wind. You might set up 200 yards away, but if the wind is blowing from your stand into that refuge cover, you're disturbing that deer. You may be 200 yards away and the deer can't see you, but it can absolutely smell you. On the other hand, if the wind is blowing from that refuge cover to you, 50 yards, if you can get in there and out without making noise and disturbing that deer, that's where I would set up. The closer that you can without disturbing that deer, the better off you're going to be. But again, it's going to be situational. And that's where that scouting pays off. Have more than one area that you can hunt around that refuge area. That way, if the wind changes, if you watch the news and you think it's going to be a south wind, go on the other side where you're going to be downwind and not going to be in that scent stream. But it's really not difficult. It's unique in every situation. But if you take a look at food, water, shelter, and how they get to it and how they get back home, you've got a whole lot better chance of being able to pattern these deer. You know, I appreciate you tuning in. I appreciate everybody's time. I'm sorry. Yep. I definitely want to remind you that we've got one more day of our Rack Madness. And sorry, I was getting a little bit of information off camera, but yeah, we are day 4 of Rack Madness. You know, it's a unique event this year. It's not the event that we've planned in the past. It's not the event we'd hoped that we would be able to bring you this year. But good Lord willing, and we all stay safe and healthy, we'll be right back next year with a big event where it truly is madness, and you guys are able to rub elbows with us and see some of the big deer that have been taken across the state. So again, I thank you for your time today. I appreciate you tuning in. I appreciate you supporting the department. Do what you can to get somebody interested in our sport. The next generation is where it's happening, you know. So make sure you get out, make sure you do a little scouting. And again, if you have any questions after this, find us on social media. We'd love to answer. Until then, we'll see you next time, and thanks for tuning in.